Hi, I'm Chris Richardson, and this is Not a Pipe podcast. Today I'm talking to Laurent de Sutter about his book, Narcocapitalism. And I just want to remind everyone that Laurent, just like all of my other guests, has provided 5 books that he recommends that anyone interested in this subject matter or learning more about his work and what's inspired it, please be sure to check out tinap.org to see what he's chosen. Also, I know a lot of people have been anticipating this. There are now stickers on the website for sale. If you want to help support This Is Not a Pipe podcast, buy a couple stickers. They'll be mailed to your door. It's a worthy cause, I like to think. Anyway, thank you, Laurent, for being on. I'm wondering if maybe you can start by saying where this idea for narco-capitalism came from. How did it get started?
It's quite a funny story, actually, because 4 years ago, I was working on a apparently very different topic, the history of striptease. And I was working on that topic because I had been asked by, artistic director of some kind of a philosophy festival in France to be the speaker at some kind of a performance whose concept was that the speaker would not be actually listened to. There would be some kind of a competition on stage, making so that people would slowly lose their concentration towards the discourse and transfer it to something else. And the something else in question was a striptease artist doing her act while I would be talking. And when they said that, would you be interested in doing this, trying this little experiment? I said, of course, I'm completely up for it. Of course, I had to produce some kind of a discourse on that. And I started to look around, and I did a very small book, which was basically the performance text and slightly extended. And then it was reproduced again because, another festival in Italy, they wanted it to be redone there. And so we did it again. And it was huge because there were 2,000 people attending, which was completely crazy. And on big stage with live band and all the stuff. It was very funny to do. And what interested me, what I was doing, seeing also the effects that it had on the audience. An audience mostly disappointed by the striptease artists, basically, because especially the women, they maybe expected something different than what they actually saw. There was this kind of disappointment towards something that was, to me, as far as I could see it, very intrinsic part of what striptease is, namely excitation. I started to fool around with this concept of excitation. In French, whether you say excitement or excitation is the same, actually. So I know that there's the nuance in English that are very different. One can be more sexual and the other more like entertainment or, oh, I'm so excited and so on and so forth. But the two dimensions, so to speak, are part of the same continuum in French. So excitation, if you want, is something that I've been fairly interested in. And when I had finished this little book, I said, okay, well, that's too bad. I mean, it's very nice, but I'm not going to make a major work on striptease. Well, I don't do major works in general, but certainly not this time. This concept was there and nothing was really done about it. But because if you look around, either in psychoanalysis, in philosophy, in sociology, and so on and so forth, it's a concept which has no literature about. I mean, there's barely anything, in terms of contemporary scholarship on what excitation is, what it means, and so on and so forth. When John Thompson, the head of Polity Press, told me that he wanted me to write a book for my series, which is something that I usually don't do, because if I write a book in my series, it means that I lose a slot. And to me, it's some kind of a waste because I publish my books at other places, whereas I love to use the slots I receive from the publishers and to fill it with the text of others. But anyway, so John Thompson told me that he wanted a book from me, and we discussed topics and so on and so forth. And I came up with this idea of the age of anesthesia, contrarily to what all these people, Hartmut Rosa and all the people, denouncing the acceleration of psychological life of the present and so on and so forth. I had the feeling that if there was something defining the contemporary psychological atmosphere was rather depression. And the depression which does not, of course, make it possible that there are very local, titillations, to speak like Spinoza, so very local forms of excitement, but so local that actually they wouldn't count compared to the general, atmosphere of depression. And I wanted to try and bridge that with the idea of excitation, to bridge it in a way that seemed to me very fruitful, and chance or luck played its role, of course, because I I bumped into a series of texts belonging to different traditions, either psychiatry, early forms of sociology or criminology, and so on and so forth, all saying something about excitation, late 19th century, all saying something about excitation, but always in a negative sense. And then I tried to build up some kind of an archaeology of the contemporary state of depression and the management of the contemporary state of depression out of the idea of the foreclosure, the forgetting, the repression of the idea of excitation, which has been something on the way, and decidedly on the way, at least at the theoretical level, since the very birth of modern psychiatry, modern sociology, modern criminology, and so on and so forth. So that's how, so to speak, the things and the idea for the book came from.
Yeah, well, that's a great introduction to it, and you've already started to answer at least some of the questions I wanted to ask you about it. I guess the first one then is, you said that you did a sort of archaeology, and that's what I was curious about, whether you saw this book as, to an extent, a history or a narrative, or digging out from before, like an archaeology. Is there a way that you would classify this book, at least primarily? Because I think it could be seen as a history, as a narrative, as a story, also as a philosophical treatise to some extent. How do you see the book working?
Well, that's very good and complicated question, because behind the few formal and stylistic choices that I've made for this book, there are a series of long obsessions that I've had for a very long time, and I'm trying to push forth with my own books, but also the different series I run either in the United Kingdom or in France. Namely, the fact that it's very, very important for me, and I don't know if it's because I come from some kind of French, upbringing where there's this old famous sentence by Buffon, the style is the man himself. Le style, c'est l'homme même. The fact that there's direct relationship between the formal, the formal choices that you make and the type of being that you are. But the same applies, of course, for thought. And there's something that irritates me a lot in Anglo-American academia these days, is the fact that the formalism of thought has become so standardized that the results produced by the outcomes can be predicted from line one. From line one what you're going to get in the end, which is a pity. Which is a pity for two reasons. It's a pity as a reader. You don't need to read the book if you know the solution from line one. But it's also a pity from the point of view of what research is, namely something that will lead you somewhere you don't know anything about, and it always reminds me of the divide that Gilles Deleuze made at a certain point in his interviews, when he said that there's a difference between people who know and people who don't. And as himself, as a philosopher, he was only interested in, and it was not simply interested. I mean, he felt that really deep inside of him, he knew nothing, and it's the fact that he knew nothing that allowed him to pursue the knowledge he didn't have in order to discover something, And this idea of exploring a field of which you're not a specialist and of which you don't know nothing, but that you need to learn about in order to get to a certain point, and then you research and you advance. It's really something that I try to translate into specific forms as books. So that's why I refuse to use any argumentative form, so I don't make claims that I will demonstrate, for instance. I don't, reason. I don't make huge attempts at building up, forms of reasonings. I don't do, and I hate that, I don't do comments. So I don't take the text that I will very, painstakingly, discuss and try and know what Derrida wanted to say in his interpretation of Althusser concerning Marx and so on and so forth. I don't do that. What I simply would like to do is to offer to really make it. Yeah, let's make an offer to the reader, if there is a reader somewhere, to share a moment with me, and during this moment to meet a certain amount of people, places, events, eventually to hear about ideas I might have, which are really ideas that I throw, like ideas that I personally call propositions, or proposals maybe in English, namely things that you can take for yourself and do something with or not, but not things that I would consider as truth that I would assess, and then I would have reached a point of, I've made, my own, my take on the world is that. It's solid, it's completely locked and built up, and the foundations are sound, and so on and so forth. It's not the way I proceed. And again, if I can, make a reference to Deleuze, it's this fantastic idea at the beginning of Difference and Repetition, when it says that if philosophy has to come to compare with some kind of a literary genre, it must be either the cop novel or science fiction. Something that will displace you, hopefully, and will lead you to some other place where then it's up to you to do your own stuff. So it's an idea that you can find also in Lyotard, when he speaks about how you will continue a sentence with another sentence and so on and so forth, how you will do to pass from a sentence to a sentence and make so that sentences will not stop and that you will continue be in a position of uttering sentences and so on and so forth. That's what I'm trying to do here in Narcocapitalism. It's a very small book, so it's all very compact. We jump from one place to another very fast. Characters enter, disappear, and then there are different domains or fields that are explored and so on, without any consideration for disciplinary boundaries or limits and so on and so forth. So mixing both the dimension, to come back to your original question, both dimension of narration, the concept is not something you demonstrate, it's something you have to tell. Basically, that's a very strong belief that I do have, but also history in the terms of trying to outline a series of things that have been forgotten and that it would be well that they would be remembered somehow, and then of course in the course of the narration and of the stories and of the history, maybe to just have some kind of a glimpse, some kind of glimpses or short circuits. It's a concept that I love too. It's a concept that Slavoj Žižek has been using a lot. His series at the MIT Press is called Short Circuits. It's not for nothing. Short circuits that would electrify you. Hopefully, again. I cannot say in advance what it will do on readers. Apparently, there are readers to whom it does nothing. So that's nice. That's perfect. But yet, short circuiting so that something happens or is produced according to such a logic, which is not a linear logic, which is not, again, a demonstrative logic, which is not a logic which is driven by some kind of a result, but more of a process, and which is a logic which is ultimately, to me at least, pragmatic. Pragmatic, not in the banal, mundane sense, but in the sense, of James and so on and so forth. So, of the fact that it's the consequences that matter. So, in the terms of a book, the meaning of the book will be actually what you do with the book. Hence the fact that I simply say things, and I try to say things that other people don't say because it's too grotesque, for instance, or too far-fetched, or too, weird. So I try to say things that are a bit exaggerated, because I think that's the point where the pragmatic dimension of discourse can happen. And just before finishing this answer, it makes me think of another reference that I love. It's Jean Baudrillard, of course, who said at some point. I don't even remember well. I should if. You never know. It's maybe something that I've completely made up. But anyway, he says somewhere that, according to him at least, theory is not there to explain the world. He said, theory is there to worsen it, to make it worse. And I've always considered this a stroke of genius, epistemological genius or methodological genius. We're not there to say what things are, because at the moment when you say what things are, we're already, things are already slipping out of our hands or falling between our fingers like sand, right? In order to catch the real at the core of reality, to use, the old Lacanian distinction, then you have to exaggerate. You have to do something that will, in the vocabulary of Baudrillard, it will be seduce reality or whatever we can call it that way. But I love this idea that we have to be always a little bit offbeat to reach a point where we can say something actually to the point. To be to the point, we have to be off the point, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And from the point of view of the form and of the point of view of the content, I'm trying to build little machines, little books, again, making big claims out of tiny ground, so to speak. That's that explains the kind of balance between narration, history, and concept that you found it in this book.
Yeah, well, it does actually explain a lot about what I can imagine went into writing this and thinking about this. And it's funny, it reminds me of conversations my partner and I had for a while. She's, grew up in French Canada. I grew up in English. To an extent, I was raised more on the pragmatical, coming from journalism as well, sort of like a Hemingway-esque, very short, very clear sentences. And she thought that just made me sound stupid because why are you telling people what to expect immediately? She almost said exactly what you said. And I remember Foucault saying something to that effect. He has to put in, sorry, it was Pierre Bourdieu who said that he has to put in something like 30% ambiguous language or something, because if he didn't, people wouldn't take him seriously in terms of philosophy. And it's a funny difference between those two approaches, because I don't think there's a lot of overlap in the sense that people like these offerings of discourses that one has to play with, or they don't. And it seems that depending on kind of how you were taught what philosophy is and what to do with it can significantly affect these things. But in both cases, I'm curious about how you went about thinking about what to offer your reader in terms of what they could then take from it. Maybe we can start with the specific idea of excitation. It's funny too, because I remember in learning French, in English, you don't necessarily have any kind of sexual connotation, I would say, to excitement. So if you said, I'm excited, I don't think anyone would necessarily jump to a sexual connotation. Whereas I remember being told later, after somebody in French asked me that, and I said in French, like, oh yeah, I'm very excited. And they kind of giggled, and they said, that can be translated as, you're very horny right now. And so that's not something that necessarily translates well. But even further, if you look at psychiatry, psychology, philosophy, and the various disciplines and how they've used that term, it seems like a very hard word to look for, because they're not necessarily putting that in a title. They're not necessarily using that as a central term. So you said you stumbled across this concept of excitation, I guess, through happenstance or through chance. How did you go on looking for it if it's not something that would be, in a list of keywords or in a list of arguments or something like that would make it fairly easy to find? How did you look for previous work dealing with excitation?
The thing is, I had something, there was something at a corner of my mind because of a very simple and banal fact of academic life. I did my PhD. Having a PhD was not a big deal. It was, one more exam to pass. And so I'm the type of guy who, I didn't even invite my family and friends to my PhD defense, right? And there was no party afterwards, nothing. So for me, PhD was not very important. It was even less important because of the fact that I had been doing my PhD on some kind of a collective project, making so that I didn't completely choose the topic of the PhD. I did my PhD because I would get paid for doing it, and I certainly didn't want to work. So I had to find a topic that I would happily, or more or less happily, work on without this topic requiring me too much effort in terms of work. So I did something about, I'm a lawyer. So I did something on the constitutional principle of representation, which is at the basis, at the background. I mean, it's the ground for the functioning of parliamentary institutions. And this constitutional principle, I examined it as it was at the time challenged by a series of experiments in various countries, in Switzerland, in the United States, in Scandinavia, and so on and so forth. Experiments about how to involve the public, the people, how to involve the people more into the decision-making process at parliamentary level. And you've heard about that. I mean, participatory democracy, hybrid forums, and all that stuff. I mean, it was very big at the very beginning of the 21st of our century. So I did my PhD on that, and while I was researching the question of representation, of course, I went through the entire history of political philosophy and political theory about representation. I did this PhD with Bruno Latour and Isabelle Stengers. So I was reading, of course, their favorite authors. For instance, the French proto-sociologist Gabriel Tarde was a big rival of Émile Durkheim. And I read Gustave Le Bon, his famous theory of the crowd and so on. And I was struck by, while I was reading this book, by the fact that there was this kind of hostility towards crowds and masses in general. And it had stuck in my mind the fact that it had something to do with this word, and the fact that the word excitation appeared in all these texts as something that was the cause of all the problems. From there, I mean, it was really about trying and looking at sources of the same period of time. And since I wanted to work on, there was this intuition about depression that I had. I wanted to see, okay, who invented actually depression? Okay, also there's this kind of Prussian guy. I've never heard about him, even though he's very famous in psychiatric circles. But it was the first time I bumped into the name, Emil Kraepelin. So Prussian psychiatrist of the second half of the 19th century, became actually the most important psychiatrist of all fucking time, right? And he wrote in 1899 in this manual, this big manual of psychiatry. He wrote about this category that he invented, namely the category of manic depressive psychosis. And for the first time, he invented some kind of, the very modern definition of the concatenation between mania and depression. While I was reading the chapters of his book dedicated to this, again, the word excitation started to pop everywhere. And I was looking to, other things. Okay, so it's depression, anesthesia. And so a web, let's say that a web of words started to unfold almost by itself, and I simply jumped from one place to the other, and everywhere I was looking, from discovery of new forms of beverages, coke infused, at the end of the 19th century, so the coke wine, coca wine, and so on and so forth, in the commercials, everywhere. So the word, as if it was a decisive word for understanding what was happening at a time at the crossroads between psychiatry, politics, of course, capitalism, chemistry, and so on and so forth. It was this word, excitation, that constituted the point of reference, even though it was never thematized by itself. I know it was something that goes not without saying, because it was said, excitation is bad, but without elaborating on that, without being thematized. It was something that it seemed so obvious to everyone that they just had to say, oh yes, the patient becomes excited in his manic phase, so at that time we have to stop the excitation, because otherwise, he might hurt himself or damage the hospital or hurt other people, and so on and so forth. So from there, I mean, it was simply about redrawing the map and putting some order into it, and and giving and choosing what to talk. And I simply picked 5 different topics, 5 different actually substances that embodied this kind of paradox of excitation as folding around itself, all these dimensions together. And then I picked chloral hydrate, an antidepressant. I picked, of course, cocaine. I picked the pill. I don't I don't give the meta text in the book when I read it. It's something that some of my publishers are not happy with that, so I will have to work on that. But I don't say, in this chapter I will speak about this, and then next chapter will be about that, and then there's an order between the different chapters, because if you go from A to B and C and D, then there's a logical order happening. I don't reveal that, so to speak. I expect it to be self-revelatory or something, that it will affirm itself. And if not, well, too bad. It means that we don't need it anyway, right? So sometimes, I tend to myself mix up within my own ideas. So the question of the night, and then finally the question of the politics of excitement itself as the end result of this process. So to make this very long and complicated answer short, it was simply about jumping from like a squirrel from one nut to the other. And I've been lucky that things appeared very, very easily, because another nice, bizarre maybe thing that I don't do research in libraries. I hate libraries. So I only research books that I can buy at secondhand, whatever. So I have way too much books at my place, my house. There's this constraint, so to speak, that I have, is that the texts that I will use there's no research assistant going to a library and doing the research for me. It's the book built itself around my own random reading, and it's kind of very empirical way of doing things.
Well, just to follow up with that, that's interesting. But I mean, are you saying that you have a 19th century book by Kraepelin in your possession or something, or how did you find these very early texts?
Well, the nice thing about the French or or Italian or other languages, European cultures, that they have this kind of fetish for old texts, and it means that old texts are actually almost always republished. And for instance, Kraepelin, I have a modern edition of the chapter on manic depressive psychosis with comments and notes and so on and so forth. Actually that's quite easy. The old 19th century material is very, very easy to access, and if it has not been reprinted or made into some kind of scientific edition, then there's this fantastic, amazing online resource of the French National Library, which has actually all of its collections before 1910, 1920 that are completely digital online for free. So you can always go and make in-text research with keywords and so on. So I mean, it's completely amazing. Of course.
That sounds great. A question then, just my last question about excitation. You say, and you point out, that so many people were using this and just assuming that everyone understood what they were talking about, and that it was a bad thing that would lead to psychic trouble, but also to political trouble perhaps, but they never really define it. When you were thinking about it, did you, in your head or in your notes perhaps, try to define what it is that you were trying to get at, or did you bracket it as a sort of black box that keeps appearing, but you're not going to go further inside? You're just going to use it as a marker of these various different aspects, whether it be sexual, psychotic, political, or what have you. Did you try to come up sort of with your own definition of excitation, or how did you approach the term in the sense of definitions?
Well, I approached it through philology, actually. I mean, it's most of the time that's what I do. So I approach it through its actual meaning. When the word originated, where it originated, in which context, and what were the effects that it produced in the web of ideas that have surrounded it through time, right? And that's where I opened my very fantastic Arnoux and Meillet etymological dictionary of Latin language. And then it was there. I mean, excitation, which is basically a juridical term, meaning that excitare is being cited, so to be called to justice, so to be taken out of your house and to be brought to the court, which led, of course, to some kind of a metaphorical understanding of it, meaning that being excited is being taken out of where we are, or taken out of one's home, taken out of oneself, so to speak. And that's, of course, what I was interested in. And it's, of course, what it could give birth to an interesting reason or interesting interpretation of why excitation is something that has been fought so fiercely by all the powers that be at the end of the 19th century and then onwards, is precisely because to be excited is to be taken away, so to be driven away from yourself, to be driven away from what would be your core, what would be your essence, what would be your very being. And the case of Aimé Kreplin that we mentioned earlier is a very good illustration of that. I mean, when he describes the symptoms, because Kreplin is the one who introduced in psychiatry the logic of the symptom and of the syndrome, and the physical understanding and reading of symptoms and syndrome as an access to the psychic life and psychic diseases. While dealing with these the symptoms in his book, he very explicitly said that, to him at least, the problems were beginning to be very dangerous once people would err, that would behave in ways that they would be indeed excited, that they would be, and the verb that he uses in German is would be led to their irre sein, to irre sein, which translates precisely to err out of your being, to be out of yourself, so to speak. And I was fascinated by the fact that there I had the explicit formulation of what was feared. What was feared was precisely the effect of excitation. You're excited, then excitation provokes or creates or leads you to go out of yourself. And the irre sein, the problem that Kreplin saw was precisely that with manic depressive persons or individuals, is that they would drive themselves into this state of irre sein, of this state of being one of themselves. And hence the necessity for him, of course, to use chloral hydrate to sedate manic depressive patients so that they could resume to what he considered as being their good state, meaning, the depressive state, as if, a good manic depressive was actually a depressive person. And of course, the action here was to stop the erring of being, the irre of sein, to go back to the sein, the being itself that was forgotten, as if treating a diseased person or mental, disabled person against excitation was precisely to reconcile the person with its own its own being. And that's the central intuition of the book, and the thing that I've tried to set up and to suggest through the book and the different stories that I tell in the book, is that the whole story, the whole question of narcocapitalism and its genealogy or archaeology leading to the invention of the concept of excitation and of the means to fight it, actually are not so much political questions that we can assess with, left or right, definition, or with progressive versus reactionary and so on and so forth, but it's a metaphysical question. It's a question about the type of conception of being that we have and that we want to promote. This is something I've not said in the book, I think, but the evidence of the importance of this metaphysical dimension, metaphysical meaning here simply having to do with big categories such as being, for instance. The best evidence I can find of the fact that it still permeates our own way of dealing with the problem is, of course, what you see when you go to the self-help department of any bookshop, where the injunction, that you will find in every of those books, which are most of them are actually terrible, not so much because of the advice they give, but because of the fact that they put you in the situation as a reader of being the one who has not understood why he or she would be unhappy and then has to do something with it. And if he or she is not unhappy after having read the book and done what the book says, then maybe he or she has not done well enough. So these are books that put people in a horrible state of dependency and so on and so forth. But the main injunction that you will find in those books is always the same: find yourself, find yourself back, go back to yourself. Forget about all those external influences that would that would make you derive out of your true self and so on and so forth. Your true self is what matters. Funny, guys, it's precisely what the psychiatrist said when they wanted to find excitation at the end of the 19th century. Your true self. But your true self is what? Your true self is the self that doesn't exceed its own limits, doesn't precisely err and go some weird places where the self is not really the self anymore, right? It felt as if it was the blocks were falling at the right place, mm-hmm. right? It's as if the construction was suddenly, it was all making sense. Not in terms of some kind of I'm realizing now that we can find some kind of conspiracy theory when you look at signs and suddenly it all appears and then, oh my God, the treasure. But this kind of from the semantic point of view, there was some kind of a continuity and derivations that one could do from the very concept of excitation, its use in 19th century different, human sciences that were all born at that time, actually, because, this was their very moment of birth, up to the present day, and the injunctions that we can find in most of the motivational speeches and self-help books and so on and so forth.
I mean, I want to ask about then the age of anesthesia as a concept, as a metaphorical concept, and as a somewhat literal concept, with people taking drugs, primarily antidepressants, things that will bring them back to themselves or what have you, where they won't be as excited and as difficult, I guess, in our contemporary age, in political nature, in a psychological nature. I was curious when reading this, how much would you say this book is about narcotics and drugs on a somewhat literal level, and how much would you say that you're using narcotics as a metaphor for something that goes far beyond?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I don't have an easy answer for that, which means that most probably the answer would be short for once. Maybe it's also part of this kind of pragmatic training that I've had, kind of Deleuzian, Latourian training. I always have the feeling that the materiality of things, objects, and so on and so forth reveal more in terms of possible interpretations and possible understanding of what surrounds us and our predicaments than simply human beings and discourse itself and so on. So there's always the temptation, maybe it can be seen as a metaphor, I hope not, but the temptation to go and see in some material field what it's all about. And in narcocapitalism, of course, it starts and ends with the discovery of anesthesia as a medical device, of course, but a medical device giving birth to some kind of a lexicon. And behind this lexicon, the perception of a series of things are possible and a series of things are not possible. Some kind of a divide of the world in terms of possible and impossible. A new divide in terms of possible and impossible. In the case of the invention of anesthesia, the physical gas, that was used, if I remember correctly, it's diethyl vapor that the two inventors of general, anesthesia actually patented. Well, the effect is immediately an effect that goes beyond, of course, the substance itself, and leads to a redefinition of the possibilities assigned, for instance, to the body. Before anesthesia, to put it very simply, what was the problem? Well, the problem was that persons would feel something, sure. And what would it lead to? Well, it would lead that the people would not be very happy to be operated, to have their teeth removed, or simply, to be operated on a battlefield and so on and so forth. So they would actually move. They would feel the pain, and they would be aware of this pain, and their body would react as something that would actually render the operations very complex, very complicated to do properly. And so anesthesia, the first effect and bodily, physical effect of anesthesia was to transform the body into something that would resist, into something that would not resist, something that would be hyperactive, excited again, because in the first manual of anesthesia and the first description of anesthesia, it's again the word excitation that comes back as something problematic that we have to deal with. Once you get rid of excitation, you have the person reduced to its own, maybe you can call it self, even though the self in question is actually matter. I mean, the body is reduced to pure matter, pure operationalizable. I don't know if it exists in English, but anyway, matter. And then the effect there is very very physical. I mean, you can see it. You can, if you're in a scientist mood, you can measure it, and so on and so forth. Right. What I discovered also through my little readings there is that the first devices, or the first gas and molecules that were used to proceed to anesthesia, are actually molecules from which a whole range of other products came afterwards. And of course, the chemical genealogy is very complicated, but it's very normal that chemists try and multiply experiments with substances when they realize that at least this substance does something. So there are plenty of substances that do nothing, no effect whatsoever. But if this substance creates some effects on, I don't know, the development of hormone, of this hormone, and so on and so forth, maybe it has other effects too. And what chemists have been doing during the last century and a half or so is try and explore the powers of small variations with substances whose effect is proven. And from there, of course, plenty of possibilities can arise. And what I've been fascinated with is the fact from this first anesthetic techniques appeared, of course, the chloral hydrate that Kraepelin used to sedate his patients, but also, of course, the very early forms of artificial narcotics, afterwards heroin, but of course also the chemistry behind the functioning of the brain that gave birth to the pill, and so on and so forth. There also some kind of a genealogical tree leading back to this idea of the anesthetics at work. And indeed, with all the substances in question, from chloral hydrate to antidepressant to the pill, up to indeed drugs such as cocaine, the effect indeed is always parallel, or there's something there that is at work in every of those circumstances that is actually the same. We want this person to keep on working. So women, there are risks that they produce too many children, and then while producing too many children, they would not be available for work. Then let's make it that it can be easier to control this and to make them in the position where they could keep on working, for instance. I don't say that it's the ultimate reason, and I don't know if there is an ultimate reason, but I say that it's part of the whole process. So rather than a metaphor, I would say that the idea of anesthesia is really something that can be assessed, let's say, physically, in the way bodies are, I would say, that are locked in some kind of a net, which I've called psychopolitical net, a net produced by the way their own psychological functioning can be altered through bodily interventions.
Actually, that's exactly what I wanted to ask about. You say somewhat early on that thanks to these inventions, the old biopolitics of the body could be confined to governmental obscurity. Psychopolitics had come onto the world stage and it was going nowhere. Is psychopolitics in this iteration a completely different sphere or net than biopolitics, or is it part of it? How do you see the connection between a sort of Foucauldian biopolitics and this psychopolitics?
Well, it's a complicated question, and for your audience who would be eventually interested in what we're talking about, they might be disappointed in discovering while reading the book that I don't directly address the distinction. I mean, there is a small footnote because, of course, if I would have done it, I would have started a whole discussion with Foucault and Agamben and blah, blah, blah. I don't have much patience for it. But to put it very, very shortly, I would say that I'm not very Foucauldian, despite the fact that I use, means that, some people have said, well, it's a very Foucauldian book, because archaeology and so on and so forth. So, okay, maybe if you say so. I'm not really pleased to know that, but if you say so, nice, because it's a compliment. There's always the nostalgia of something with the concept of biopolitics, and it's even more visible with Agamben. I mean, I love Agamben, I do. It always hurts me when I have to say something wrong about the guy. I mean, he's just so fantastic. I mean, he's such a brilliant writer, so everything he does, I buy, and I buy directly in Italian. I don't even want to wait for French translations or whatever. But I must confess that there is something that I cannot accept with Agamben, which is it's the underlying nostalgia for something that would be pure and authentic. That, he would say, no, it's not true, and so on and so forth. I say, come on, man, read your own text. I mean, it's there. You long for something at least more pure than what we are confronted with today. And this longing for something better and more pure is precisely the type of move that I'm trying to undo here. The very idea of the purity of the self, of a possible self, a self that would be free from all these embarrassment of the outside world and of the trouble that the world may lead us to produce apropos ourselves, right? This whole idea is still active in the concept of biopolitics and division between, bare life, Zoe, and bios, the life as it is embedded into political and political, legal, and so on, dispositives. And I'm afraid that is present also in Foucault and in most of today's leftist theory. I mean, this idea that we can go back to a state where we can really be ourselves again, something that actually they share with with self-help. I don't believe that. I mean, I really don't. It's impossible to live with that as an horizon because it's purely phantasmatic horizon. If we are anything, we're only the supplements that we have added to ourselves. It's something that the paleontologists have shown from the very early age of humanity, tens of thousands of years from now. I mean, it's not ourself, our life, pure life that makes us human beings. It's precisely the opposite. It's all the rest, all the accessories, all the things that that are not part of our essence. Be it stones and rocks that you will use to cut things, or the first sticks that you will use to catch fish or anything, and so on and so forth. And humanity only exists insofar as it has things, to use the distinction made by Gabriel Tarde and that Bruno Latour has reused in recent years, the distinction between an ontology of being and an ontology of having, which is, of course, very complex and complicated, especially in the context of capitalism, because some, of course, would very uncharitably interpret that as ontology of having, but having is the very definition of, capitalism as having, having money, having objects that we don't need, and so on and so forth. And come on, wait a minute, right? There's a difference in intensities in terms of having. But the fact is that it's our having, so to speak, having properties, having friends, having experiences, and so on and so forth, that define, so to speak, what we are. And in such a way that what we are is never stabilized, because there's always something that will add to the pile, something that we will lose, and so on and so forth. So there's no core essence to reach at any point of that. I mean, it's all these accessories that make our ontological world. And that's why I'm not so fond of the concept of biopolitics, because from the point of view of ontology, I would say, it still recalls, I don't say that it would be something that they would say, the defenders of the concept would state explicitly, and most probably they will not, but it's something that's still active, I would say, within the concept. Yeah, I disagree with. That's why I use this idea of psychopolitics to maybe like as an ironical concept, maybe not a concept to be taken too seriously, as a way to put this whole bodily affair in an even tinier box, which is the box of our psyche, which is really a box where it's impossible to isolate anything, and you can never put your hand on it. But nevertheless, it can be the aim of strategies, and so on and so forth. So it's kind of an empty, impossible to grasp thing, which would be the psyche, the psyche, and as an alternative to this idea that there would be a pure life of the body somewhere that we have to reconcile us with.
No, I thank you for that. It makes sense thinking more about your book again, and the differences and similarities to those kinds of projects. Like you said, I don't want to imply at all that this is in any way like a self-help book and that you're giving advice to people. At the same time, though, I feel like in any kind of project, in any kind of research, there's some kind of purpose, I guess, beyond just a fascination. So yours is explicitly, I guess, from what you've just said now, not about returning to some kind of pure body before it has been disciplined by the contemporary apparatus and things like this. It also seems, though, that the age of Anastasia doesn't sound so great. I mean, as a place to live, right? And if that's the case, and therefore I assume that you're somewhat not in favor of all of us anesthetizing ourselves, is there something that you would, I guess, suggest to people as a way to not necessarily, go back to a pure essence or state, or even a pure mental state, but is there a better alternative, I suppose, to anesthetizing ourselves, and what might that look like?
Yeah, of course. I mean, this is also why it's a book about substances. I mean, that substances, when you go back to their very roots, I mean, it's now a textbook reference, but Plato and Derrida, the whole idea of pharmakon. So the whole idea that what is a poison is also a remedy somehow at the same time, and the other way around, a remedy might very well be a poison, which is actually the logic at the base of vaccines and so on and so forth. There's the idea that all these substances, I mean, I don't want to condemn there. I don't want to say Coke is bad, don't sniff, or don't take antidepressant, or don't take the contraceptive pills. Please, no, that's not what I say. What I say is simply, or what I'm trying to say, maybe what I'm trying to suggest is there's this bizarre history about all these things. It's there. It's part of their genetics, so to speak. It's part of genetics of all these substances. It's part of the possibles that they involve. Can't we imagine other possibles with the same substances, for instance, or with analogical substances, or with different substances, or with no substance at all? The possibilities that are involved, are they the only possibilities that we have at hand? And that's why excitation is interesting, because excitation leads us to the moment when you blow the limits, you go out of the frontiers of your being, but you go out of the frontiers, you break the limits, or your limits, whether they're imposed, self-imposed, or natural, if it exists, and so on and so forth. So I would advocate for the fact that looking at all those things is not a question of adding to the pile of critical literature on things. I mean, I have the feeling that actually critique is dead and gone, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's everything can be criticized, and there's strategies and capitalism and domination and in everything, every fucking thing. So the question is not so much if we are going to denounce a little bit more. I mean, there are plenty of work that's doing that and brilliantly and so on and so forth. But then what can we do afterwards? And the only answer I can have is that dealing with the type of possibles that we want, and reframe or reshape the possibles involved within the impossibles that are at stake. To give a practical example, I'm very interested in what the xenofeminists are doing and are saying about, for instance, the whole do-it-yourself hormone, experiment, and first, of course, construction, the way that you decide to dose your own pill and to create it yourself. Above or beyond that, the way you can deal with your own hormones in transgender transition, for instance. These are ways or proposals, again, or that I feel could lead us, if we take them seriously and do something with it, could lead us to shift our gaze upon these realities. Even if you remember some big failures of the 20th century, I think Timothy Leary, right? Mm-hmm. But there was an idea there, the idea that maybe it could help, LSD maybe could help in leading us somewhere else. It didn't, too bad. But the fact that it was possible to still explore it, that is in itself for me interesting. So if there's a message in the book, of course, it's certainly not to consider it as this kind of narcocapitalism of anesthesia as some prison we're in. I mean, what I've been trying to do is simply to give tools for possible description of what we are, of our predicament and of its roots. But from a description does not lead necessarily, or does not result necessarily, a locked situation. I mean, it's a description, then another description is possible, and another description can be possible also if we shift the coordinates of the predicament itself. So, yeah, I would always look for the possible rather than the impossible.
Laurent, I want to thank you. I feel like that is a brilliant way to wrap up and think about the overall project that you've done in narcocapitalism. And I really appreciate you speaking to me today.
Well, I'm honored. Again, I'm honored and pleased to have had this conversation with you.
Once again, thank you for listening to This Is Not a Pipe podcast. Check out our website at tinapp.org or visit us on any of the social media you're using. And please, if you get a chance, leave a review. I'm really honored to be able to speak with some really brilliant people in the weeks and months ahead, and I hope you'll tune in for that.